The service manager at Whitmore Automotive didn't look up from his clipboard when he said it. He just flipped the folder shut, set it on the counter between them, and said the words like he'd said them 100 times before, because he probably had. Mr. Calloway, at this point, you'd be throwing good money after bad. Bernard Calloway stood on the other side of that counter and said nothing. He was 63 years old, had built 3 companies from nothing, and had sat across from men far more intimidating than a service manager in a golf shirt. But something about the way the man spoke, not unkind, not cruel, just completely indifferent, made the words land harder than they should have. The car in question was a 1987 Land Rover Defender 110, dark green, the color of old forests, with a snub-nosed front end and a roof rack that had seen more of northern Ontario than most people would ever see in a lifetime. Bernard had bought it new. His wife Elaine had named it. They'd driven it across Newfoundland the summer their daughter was born, and his daughter had learned to drive in it in an empty parking lot in Sudbury on a Saturday morning in October. It had 340,000 kilometers on it, and it still smelled like engine oil, and the cedar air freshener Elaine had always kept tucked under the dash. The engine had seized 2 weeks ago on the highway outside Barrie. Not dramatically, no fire, no bang, just a long, grinding reluctance, then silence. 3 shops had looked at it since then. 3 shops had told Bernard essentially the same thing. Whitmore Automotive was the 4th. The block is cracked, the service manager said. He was already moving toward the next thing, already half done with this conversation. You'd need a full engine rebuild, and frankly the parts availability on these old Defenders is a nightmare. We're looking at $9,000, maybe $11,000, and that's if we can source the right components. For a vehicle this age, that math doesn't make sense. It makes sense to me, Bernard said. The service manager looked up for the first time. He seemed mildly surprised that Bernard was still talking. I understand the sentimental value, he said, but my professional recommendation is to let it go. Bernard picked up the folder. He didn't open it. He just held it for a moment, then set it back down and walked out to the parking lot. His daughter Petra was waiting in the rental car, one knee pulled up against the dash, scrolling through her phone. She was 31, sharp-eyed, with her mother's patience, and her father's inability to pretend something didn't matter when it did. She looked up when she heard his footsteps on the gravel. Same answer, he said. She didn't say anything right away. She put her phone down and looked at the side of his face. Dad, you know we don't have to. I know, he said. He got in. He looked out the windshield for a while at nothing in particular. Then he pulled out his phone and opened the Notes app, where he'd written down the name of a place someone mentioned him almost as an afterthought. A mechanic out in Cookstown. Someone Petra's colleague had used. The colleague had said, and this was the part Bernard kept coming back to, that the man hadn't even started the car before he knew what was wrong with it. He'd just listened. Rook Dempsey had been up since 5. That wasn't unusual. He was almost always up before the sun, mostly because his daughter, Hazel, had been an early riser since she was 3 weeks old, and even now, at 8 years old, she still padded out to the kitchen before 6 on most mornings, sat at the table, and ate cereal while watching the birds at the feeder outside the window, with the same focused attention she gave to everything. Hazel didn't do anything halfway. She watched the birds like she was memorizing them. It was a Tuesday in late March, and the ground outside Cookstown was still half frozen, the gravel driveway marked with frost heaves that had been getting worse all winter. Rook's shop sat at the back of the property, a converted barn with 2 bays, a wood stove he kept burning from October to April, and shelves that ran floor to ceiling along the east wall, organized in a system that looked chaotic from the outside, but made complete sense to anyone who'd ever had to find a 1971 Land Rover Series 3 swivel ball pin bearing at 11 o'clock on a Thursday night. He'd built the shop himself, mostly, with help from his father-in-law in the early years before Joanna got sick. After she passed, he'd kept building. It gave him somewhere to put his hands. Rook was 44 years old. He had the kind of face that looked younger until you got close, and then you could see the tiredness around the eyes. The kind that doesn't come from one bad night, but from 3 years of being the only adult in a house, where the grief was still present, just quieter now. He was not a large man, but he had large hands, mechanic's hands, and he moved through the shop with a kind of economy of motion that came from spending 20 years doing the same things in the same space and learning exactly how much effort each task required. He had no website. He had a business card, one design, same as it had been for 15 years, with his name, his number, and a single line underneath, "We listen first." His neighbor Gord had made fun of that line when Rook first printed the cards. "Sounds like a therapist," Gord said. "Sometimes it's the same work," Rook had said. The phone rang at 8:15. He was under a Ford F-250, checking a noise in the front differential that the owner had been told by 2 other shops was a worn CV joint. It wasn't a worn CV joint. He'd known that from the moment he'd heard the truck come up the driveway, a low intermittent knock with a frequency that was wrong for a CV, too slow, too regular, but he hadn't said anything yet. He'd wanted to listen to it a few more minutes first. He let the phone go to his answering machine, a actual answering machine, cassette tape, purchased in 1998, and finished what he was doing. When he called back, a man named Bernard answered on the second ring and explained the situation carefully and without embellishment, which Rook appreciated. Most people who called about a seized engine led with how much the car meant to them. Bernard led with the symptoms, the sound it had made, the conditions when it happened, the highway, the speed, the temperature that day. Rook asked 4 questions. Then he said, "Bring it in." Bernard paused. "Just like that?" "Just like that." "You don't want to know what the other shop said?" "I'll find out what's wrong with it myself," Rook said. "If what they said is right, I'll tell you. If it isn't, I'll tell you that too." There was a silence that Rook recognized. It was the silence of someone who had been told no enough times that yes required a moment to process. "Thursday?" Bernard said. "Thursday's fine." The Defender arrived on a flatbed at 10:15 Thursday morning, and Rook stood in the driveway and watched it come off the truck without saying anything. He walked around it once, slowly, hands in his jacket pockets. He crouched at the front left wheel well. He opened the hood and looked at the engine for a long time without touching anything. Hazel had a PA day from school. She sat on the workshop step in her winter coat, eating an apple, watching her father the way she watched the birds. "What's wrong with it?" she asked. "Don't know yet," he said. "Then what are you doing?" "Looking," he said. He straightened up and glanced at her. "Before you touch something, you look at it. Before you look at it, you listen. What does it tell you before you've done anything to it?" Hazel considered this. "It looks old," she said. "It is old. Does old mean broken?" He looked at the Defender for another moment. "Not always," he said. Bernard Calloway arrived 20 minutes later, Petra with him. Rook shook Bernard's hand and noted that the man's grip was firm, but not performative. The grip of someone who had worked, actually worked, at some point in his life, not just managed people who did. He introduced himself to Petra, who gave him a look that was not unfriendly but was clearly evaluating, which he didn't mind. "I'll need a few hours," Rook said. "There's a diner in town, Harbor Light, good coffee, or you're welcome to wait here." "We'll wait," Petra said, before her father could answer. Rook went to work. He started the same way he always started, not by turning anything on, but by being still. He sat in the driver's seat with the door open and put his hands on the steering wheel and just inhabited the space for a minute. People thought this was strange. He'd stopped explaining it years ago. What he was doing was resetting his expectations, clearing out everything he thought he knew so he could hear what was actually there. Then he got out and started at the front and worked backward. The block at first pass looked like what the other shops had said. There was evidence of heat stress. There was scoring on the cylinder walls when he pulled the head. A cracked block was a reasonable conclusion from what was visible. But there was something else, a smell that was wrong, Not the smell of a gasket failure or overheating alone. Something else underneath it, older. He spent 20 minutes with his face closer to the engine than was entirely comfortable, and traced it back to the coolant system, and specifically to a bypass hose that had failed. Not recently, but months ago, slowly, in a way that would have been nearly invisible until it wasn't. The hose had been leaking into the valley of the engine, not externally, not in any place a routine check would catch. The engine hadn't seized from a sudden failure. It had been slowly drowning. He pulled the hose. He looked at it for a long time. Then he took it inside and held it under the shop light. The hose itself was original, 37 years old. It had a failure point at the second clamp, a microfracture that had been propagating for probably the better part of a year. The leak had been so slow it had never triggered a temperature warning. The coolant had just been quietly misting into spaces it shouldn't be, evaporating mostly, until the day on the highway when conditions combined in exactly the wrong way. The block was stressed, but the block was not cracked. He sat with that for a moment. 3 shops had seen a seized engine and gone straight to the conclusion that fit the bill, the one that required the least additional investigation, the one that generated the biggest repair estimate. Nobody had gone looking for the reason behind the reason. Rook set the hose on his workbench and went to find Bernard. Bernard was sitting on a lawn chair Petra had found in the shop's side bay, drinking tea from a thermos he'd brought himself. Hazel was showing him something on a piece of paper. She'd been drawing, apparently, a detailed schematic of what she imagined the inside of the engine looked like, with labels. Bernard was studying it with what appeared to be genuine interest. "She's got the basic architecture right," Rook said, nodding at the drawing. "Cylinders are in the right place. Good instinct." Hazel looked pleased in the quiet way she looked pleased, which meant her face didn't change much, but her posture straightened slightly. "So," Bernard said. "The block isn't cracked," Rook said. The silence that followed was one of the most particular kinds Rook knew. The silence of someone who has been bracing for bad news for so long that good news requires the same adjustment time. He'd heard it before. He waded through it. "Then what?" Petra started. "Bypass hose. Original to the vehicle. It failed slowly, internally. No external leak, no warning light. It compromised the coolant system over time, and the engine seized when conditions pushed it past the threshold." He looked at Bernard. "It's not a rebuild. You need a coolant system overhaul, the hose replaced, a thorough inspection of the cylinder head and gaskets. Some of that may need attention, and then we run it carefully and see where we are. But the block is sound." Bernard set his tea down. He didn't say anything for a moment. He just looked at the shop, at the shelves, at Hazel's drawing, at the Defender sitting in the bay with its hood up. 3 shops, he said finally. It wasn't quite a question. "It's an easy conclusion to reach," Rook said. He didn't say it to make Bernard feel better. He said it because it was true. The damage pattern looks like a cracked block. You'd have to go looking for something else to find it. And you went looking. I always go looking. Petra had her arms crossed. She was staring at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "What's the repair cost?" she said. He quoted her a number that was approximately 1/6 of the lowest estimate Bernard had received elsewhere. She uncrossed her arms. Rook worked on the Defender for 4 days. Hazel came to the shop after school each day and sat at her usual spot on the step, doing homework or drawing or asking questions with the careful precision of a child who had figured out that her father didn't mind questions as long as they were genuine. On the 3rd day, she asked him why the other mechanics hadn't found what he found. He was quiet for a while. He was cleaning the cylinder head, a slow process that required attention. "They looked at what was in front of them," he said eventually. "They saw something that looked like the answer, and they stopped looking." "But you didn't." "No." "Why not?" He set down the brush and looked at her. She was 8 years old and she was watching him with her mother's eyes. The same particular quality of attention, the kind that made you want to give a real answer, even when a simpler one would do. "Because the car was telling me something was wrong with that answer," he said, "and I've learned to trust that more than what I think I already know." Hazel wrote something in her notebook. He didn't ask what. On the fourth day, at around 2 in the afternoon, he started the engine. It ran. Not perfectly, there was still work ahead, adjustments to make, a few things to watch, but it ran. The sound was the sound of an engine that had always been sound, underneath everything, and was now just remembering it. He stood in the bay with his hands in his pockets and listened to it idle, and felt the specific, uncomplicated satisfaction of a thing being returned to what it was supposed to be. He called Bernard. When Bernard came to pick up the Defender, he brought Petra, and he also brought, somewhat unexpectedly, a man named Theodore who turned out to be his son-in-law, an engineer who worked in manufacturing outside Hamilton, and who had apparently insisted on coming after hearing the story. Theodore walked around the Defender the way engineers walk around things, methodically, with his hands clasped behind his back, stopping to look at specific points with specific attention. "May I?" he said, gesturing at the engine bay. "Go ahead," Rook said. Theodore spent 12 minutes examining the engine. He came back and looked at Rook with the expression of someone who has had a professional assumption quietly revised. "The bypass hose," he said. "You identified it by smell?" "Partly," Rook said. "Partly by sound. Partly by elimination." The other shops didn't. They did what made sense given what they saw. The diagnosis wasn't wrong, exactly. It was just incomplete. Theodore nodded slowly. He had the look of a man filing something away. "I have a situation," he said, "at our facility in Hamilton. A compressor unit that 3 separate maintenance teams have diagnosed with a bearing failure. We're looking at a full replacement." He paused. "Could I ask you to look at it?" Rook looked at him for a moment. "I work on vehicles," he said. "I know. But the way you—" Theodore stopped. Tried again. "The way you approach this is the thing I'm looking for. The methodology, not the specific expertise." "Tell me about the sound it makes," Rook said. Theodore blinked. "Sorry?" "The compressor. Tell me about the sound it makes." Theodore described it. Rook listened without interrupting, without looking at anything except the middle distance, the way he listened to engines from down the driveway before he'd even parked his truck. When Theodore finished, Rook said, "It's not the bearings." Theodore stared at him. "It might be a pressure relief valve that's not seating correctly. Intermittent leak creating a load resonance. Bearings would give you a different frequency." He looked at Theodore. "I could be wrong, but I'd look there first." The silence that followed was similar to the one when Bernard had heard about the bypass hose, but different in character. This was the silence of a professional who has just been handed something unexpected by someone from outside his field, and is trying to figure out whether to be defensive about it or grateful. Theodore chose grateful. Hazel was at school when Bernard finally drove the Defender out of the bay, but Rook had told her it would happen that afternoon, and she'd made him promise to take a photo. He took one on his phone. The Defender sitting in the driveway in the late afternoon light, that dark green catching the sun, the way it must have caught it 37 years ago when it was new and everything was still ahead of it. He sent it to her at 3:30. Just before the school bus came down the road, her response was 3 characters, Baltstieri. He put his phone in his pocket and went back into the shop. 2 days later, Theodore called from Hamilton. The pressure relief valve had been the issue. A faulty seat, a hairline compromise in the seal, creating exactly the load pattern Rook had described. The maintenance team had replaced the valve assembly in 4 hours. The compressor was running. The full replacement, which had been quoted at over $40,000, was no longer necessary. Theodore wanted to refer Rook to 3 other facilities. Rook said he appreciated that, and he might take him up on it sometime. But right now he had a 1993 Jeep YJ with an ignition problem that had been baffling its owner for 8 months, and he wanted to get to that while the afternoon light was still good. Theodore laughed, somewhat helplessly, and said he understood. What Rook didn't mention, because it wasn't the kind of thing he talked about easily, was that the Jeep belonged to a woman named Kay who lived 20 minutes east of Cookstown, and drove to dialysis 3 times a week, and that the ignition problem had been making her nervous for months, because she'd been told by 2 shops that the repair was too complex to estimate without tearing the dash apart, and that she'd been nursing the thing along with a screwdriver she kept in the cup holder as a workaround. Every morning before dawn, on roads that were still dark, he'd heard about Kay from Gord. He'd called her himself. He wasn't charging her anything. He didn't think about this as generosity, particularly. He thought about it the same way he thought about most things. You hear about a problem, you look at it honestly, you do what the situation asks for. The situation asked for a mechanic who would not tell Kay her ignition was too complex to estimate. So that was what he was. He was under the Jeep's dash at 4 o'clock, the wood stove going, Hazel doing homework at the bench behind him, when she said, without looking up from her book, "Did Mr. Calloway's car sound like it was going to be okay?" "Before you fixed it?" Rook thought about this. "It sounded like it wanted to be okay," he said. Hazel considered that for a moment. "That's the same thing," she said. He didn't answer right away. The wood stove ticked in the quiet. Outside, the light was going to that low gold that came in late March when the days were getting longer, but the cold hadn't let go yet, and it came through the bay door at an angle that caught the dust in the air and made the whole shop look warmer than it was. "Yeah," he said finally. "I think it is." He went back to listening.